What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the HSC Economics Review. This is part 2 of a 3-part series, which will be focusing on the impact of COVID-19, specifically on the Australian economy. Now, we are going to look at it through the lens of some key areas in your HSC syllabus. And so we're just to get right into it, right? Obviously, it's COVID-19 has impacted economies all around the world, Australia no exception. And just to start things off, I think the biggest question for everybody is, what kind of impact should we be expecting for economic growth?
And that's a great question, Terry. And I think what the analysts are sort of saying is they're really looking at, and you've probably seen this if you've been reading any of the, the sort of reports in the papers, something that they're calling a U-shaped or a V-shaped recovery. So clearly, a mandatory shutdown of businesses is going to have a significant impact on economic growth. If we just go back to basics for a moment, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. If we're shutting industries down, there's going to be significant impact on, consumption, on exports and imports, particularly given the current conditions as well. So what we're seeing is that really a V-shaped recovery is where you have a very quick bounce back. So you have a very short-lived recession, and then you have a quick return to business as normal, in essence. Now, a U-shaped is this idea that, well, we go into a recession, but it takes us a lot longer to come out of it. So we're sort of down at the bottom of the U for a lot longer, and then eventually, hopefully, we come out. So to some extent, right, the analysts aren't really sure yet where we're going to land. It's a little too early to tell if it's going to be U or V, although I feel like most people are opting and starting to feel like it's more of a U than it is a V. Although we have, relatively been very successful, right, in handling Corona, which will give us a better chance of a V. Now, what do these look like? Well, NAB did some modelling, and what they identified was that assuming, that we were in a V shape, so we were having a fairly quick recovery, they were expecting negative 3% growth for the economy this year, followed by 3.4% growth for 2021. Now, that's pretty interesting because that's like best case scenario, really, V-shaped. The U-shape on the other side is, sort of more a severe downside, worst case. And what did NAB sort of predict for that, Terry?
So a lot more pessimistic in this case. Obviously, this would be the severe downside or the U-shaped recovery. And so we're talking here of a shrink of 2.5% this year. 2.5% next year, but this year we would be falling 3%. So not really much of that kind of recovery, right? So that's what we're talking about here. Whereas in the previous example, there was, there was quite a significant bounce back. But in this case, as we're saying, it's going to shrink, probably shrink again the next year. And then the year after, in 2022, we'll only get about a weak 2% rebound in economic growth. Unemployment would also be lower this year at 7.4%. Than in the base case, but it would start to rise over time. So I think, Rowan, you mentioned in our previous video that unemployment does tend to be a bit more of a lag statistic. So I think that would be what's playing out in this severe down, pessimistic expectation.
Well, I think either, to be honest, right, in the V shape, even with the quick recovery to 3% growth, 3.4% growth, I should say, in 2021, I think we would still see unemployment remain elevated, right? Because it is a lagging indicator. So as you can see, guys, I just want to flag here for a moment, Australia has had the enviable record of 30 years of successive, economic growth. And really what has been identified is, I think with all expectations, that we will be in a recession. There will be 2 quarters, and the way we define a recession is 2 quarters of negative economic growth. That's why in the GFC period, we missed the technical recession because we only had 1 quarter. And so we can see that also this gives a nice, from an economic point of view for HSC Economics, a nice comparative point once again to the GFC, where we saw, a little dip in economic growth. We hit 1 quarter negative growth, but not beyond. And I think clearly the evidence here is that it will be a significant decrease in growth this year and likely next year, depending on just the extent to which fiscal stimulus makes a difference. So, look, that's the big picture for economic growth. Now, of course, the thing to highlight here is that there are many different perspectives on this. So, we just sort of unpacked NAB. I think if you look at, Westpac, Westpac have expected that overall they think the economy is going to contract 5% this year. So NAB were in their sort of best case saying, well, look, we think we think it's going to be a 3% shrinkage. We can then compare that, to the RBA, okay, which is saying that they think baseline scenario is that it's going to, economic growth is going to contract by 6%, a bounce back of 6% next year in a very sharp V-shaped recovery. So I think if you're trying to start using this, if you're doing analysis on economic growth and the impact of Corona, and in fact, the hard part is even when you sit your HSC, the data won't be clear even by then. You might have, probably by then you'll be lucky if you've got 2 quarters of official growth data, that have been Corona impacted. You may not yet have that second quarter that's yet available. So you'll need to be looking at the 1 quarter that you have plus what the projections are. And depending on the argument you want to raise, you might be referencing different data points. You might be looking, and the RBA is often a safe place to go there, but you might also then be referencing, the RBA are quite aggressive in their predictions right now, both for the decreasing growth and the bounce back. So you might then pick another example, whether or not it's NAB or Westpac or PwC or Deloitte, any of these other big major banks and accounting firms to provide analysts, so that you can get a sense and still have some form of opinion that you're providing in your essays, even if the data is not yet finalized.
So it sounds like, Rowan, you're suggesting that students should have, I guess, multiple statistics which they are considering for these particular indicators.
Look, yeah, I know that's going to sound horrible because there's already so many statistics to know, right? And it's like, but I think, look, particularly, if you're getting a question that's changes in the global economy and its impact on economic conditions, or even just how successful, or analyze the effectiveness of macroeconomic policy response. The challenge that we'll have is that the data won't be yet set. Even with our unemployment data, that's one of the things we'll talk about. It's not yet clear what's happening. And so unfortunately, it means, I think, that it will place a greater onus on students to have, a little bit more breadth in the data that they have sort of, in their sort of data pack, so to speak, that they're pulling out, whereby previous years, you didn't need it because it was pretty clear the data would be very unchanging. It would be 5.2%. It would be, for unemployment, it would be, 2.3, whatever. It would be fairly similar. So what about unemployment, Terry?
Obviously, the April figures for unemployment were released fairly recently. And so we were able to see that unemployment actually did increase from 5.2% to 6.2%, which was one of our largest increases that we've had in quite some time. And also at the same time, the participation rate actually also fell to a 15-year low. It fell from 66% to 63.5%. And so what that really shows is that, yes, there have been more people who are unemployed. And if we remember our definition of unemployment, it is somebody who does not currently have employment and is actively seeking employment. So yes, whilst that went up, I think what's also very interesting to consider is that our overall participation actually also declined as well, which implies that people, they aren't really going to be showing up in those unemployment statistics if they aren't participating in the labour force.
And I think that's a really key point to make, Terry, because I think, what we saw was ultimately, unemployment jump up by 1%, 5.2 to 6.2 based on the April data. And if we think about it, that doesn't seem that bad, given everything that's happening, the stuff we shared about, the unemployment rates in the US, it sounds like, well, it's not so bad. But I think if we look at it, I think a big part, right, is while only 104,500 people became, officially unemployed, I think the issue is if we look at those that just stopped trying to find a job, It's actually a change of 600,000 people that lost their job, but we've seen almost 500,000 of them basically tap out and go, you know what, there's no jobs out there. Like, there's no point even looking for it. I'm just going to stop actively seeking work. So our unemployment figure is actually, there's a lot of hidden unemployment here, really, which is, you know, a type of unemployment that often I think when we're looking at the types of unemployment in the HSC economic course, you know, we talk about hidden, but it's not something we necessarily can appreciate in terms of the impact it can have in really making one unemployment figure look particularly good, but also the impact it has on just the degree to which we've got underutilized resource, right? That's there, but it's just not seeking work. So I think it's particularly interesting. Now, what does that mean for what the true jobless rate might be? If we try to factor that in, Terry, you know, what's the data say about the true jobless rate?
Well, I think we also just got to quickly just add in the underemployment rate into the equation as well, right? Because the underemployment rate basically measures people who do currently have a job, right? But they are able and willing to be working more hours. And I think that's the other thing. While some people didn't completely lose their jobs due to COVID, they've had their hours significantly cut. And so there was also a massive increase in the amount of underemployment, going from 8.8%, which it was fairly stable at for quite some time, up to 13.7%. And so in economics, we have something which is called the underutilization rate, right? And that's if we add the underemployment rate with the unemployment rate, add those two numbers together, and you get an overall picture, right, of what kind, the extent of labor resources which currently aren't being used. And then you should also then factor in those who are hidden unemployed. So lots to think about. Is there anything you want to add to that, Rowan?
So I think, Terry, just to add the key sort of statistic there is that if we combine our underemployment and our unemployment statistics, we get an underutilization, and that's actually at 19.9%, which is crazy. It means that almost 1 in 5 people in the economy are either unemployed or have additional hours of work they would like to do, but it's not available. Now, an additional stat here that's well worth using is that if we factor in the hundreds of thousands of people that lost work, that gave up trying to find work, if we actually count them still in the unemployment rate, even though technically we don't, if we were to, our true unemployment rate would be closer to 9.6%. So we can certainly see just the impact of, you know, unemployment. You know, clearly if we were at 5.2, 9.6, we're not there yet, but almost doubling in the pace of, you know, a 2-month period, which is quite significant. So I think one of the things that's interesting for me about, you know, unemployment as well is that certain industries are particularly hit. And I think just a comment I'd make before we keep on moving is that economies that have a relatively higher service sectors I think, will struggle a little bit more, even if they have great ability to control through lockdowns the spread of the virus, because ultimately it means that a high percentage of, you know, the population are employed in those industries that are particularly vulnerable, right, to industry shutdown or impact. And so I think we've certainly seen that happen for us. And on top of that, you know, if we're going back to unemployment, a question I'd have for you is, you know, one of the parts of the unemployment course asks you to look at the impact of unemployment on particular groups within the economy. So I guess my question, Terry, here is, what's happening with our unemployment for particular groups of the economy right now?
Well, I think one thing is to obviously lead on for those particular sectors and in the services industry is that a lot of those workers in those jobs are actually quite young. Right? A lot of them are between the ages of 20 to 29. A lot of them are even teenagers. And so they are being disproportionately affected in terms of the loss of employment and the loss of hours compared to other age groups. We've also got the over 70 age group as well, because it's more likely that those would also be involved in things like accommodation, in things like hospitality, in things like arts and recreation services. So that it is also having a little bit of an impact, I guess, on the distribution of income and the inequality that exists between different age groups. We've also got women who are also being affected more so than men in this particular situation, with them having an 8.1% fall in the number of jobs compared to men who are only at 6.2%. And again, you could probably attribute that to just the nature of the work of specific groups in the economy.
That's right. So what we're sharing, guys, is there's some great stats here that you can use. If you in your notes, go back to your notes when you're looking at unemployment and the differences for particular groups in an economy, and then certainly for as well, where we look at sort of the groups and how certain demographics within the population are more impacted. We're seeing that play out through Corona's impact in the economy, and so there's definitely some data here that you can use. Now, look, overall, the RBA expects that unemployment will peak at 10%. And should still remain at over 7% by the end of the year. And that's pretty common. We see that AMP also has predicted, figures close to a 10% unemployment rate. Westpac have said, they've been a little more aggressive. They expected unemployment might peak at 17% in the June quarter and settle to about 9% by year's end. Now, some of this is of course being influenced by JobKeeper, which is something we'll talk about in part 3, in terms of to what extent are some of these predictions going to be, changed or influenced by the effectiveness of government response. So I think all in all, though, we can certainly see that the unemployment rate by the end of the year is going to be, if we look at all of the different analysts and their opinions, somewhere between 7.5% and 10%. Like, no one really disagrees on that fact. It's going to be somewhere in that zone. And then the concern is, given the likelihood of a U-shaped rather than a V-shaped recovery, that we'll see quite a lag over the long term. And unfortunately, it often does mean that, you see a growth of long-term unemployed that can occur. And that can take quite a long time for an economy to shift. And so you do see almost this hangover effect in unemployment that occurs after a recession. And arguably, we saw that for even the GFC, a number of years for certain age groups and demographics, that there was, particularly young people, elevated levels of unemployment that have taken a considerable long time to shift post a recession. So maybe this is a good segue, Terry, to start thinking about consumer confidence, because of course the degree to which unemployment changes is really a question of economic growth, and that's often driven in big ways by consumption. What's been happening with consumer confidence in the Australian economy?
Well, obviously, if people are unemployed and they don't have a stable, consistent income to spend, their confidence is obviously going to be quite shot. And in fact, the Westpac Melbourne Institute Index of Consumer Sentiment, which measures basically how confident consumers are feeling, it fell by 17.7% from March to April, which was the largest drop it has ever had in the 47 years which they've recorded consumer confidence. So that should tell you that this really is quite dramatic. It's more impactful than anything that we experienced in the GFC in terms of consumer confidence and sentiment. And so it's falling it's really falling. It fell from 91.9 to 75.6. Now it's an index number, so basically the bigger the number, the more confident. And so it really did kind of jump out at me, because I was just so shocked at what a big plunge it took.
And I think what's interesting about it is, that the last time confidence levels were at this level were during deep recessions. So the 1990s, it was 64.6. The 80s, when we had a recession, was 75. So really, the pace of the drop is akin to something that we would see from the Great Depression, and certainly it's well beyond GFC. Now I think what I found interesting was that if we look at where the biggest shift has been, the sentiment and the way we get to this index is there's actually a number of different things that it attempts to measure, right? It attempts to measure our expectations around finances now versus a year ago, economic conditions over the next 12 months, whether or not it's the right time to buy a major household item, whether or not it's time to buy a dwelling. And what's interesting is that the ones where we see that consumer confidence has just fallen off an absolute cliff is, one, economic conditions over the next 12 months, probably no surprise there. Two, time to buy a major household item if people are uncertain about their employment prospects. We know that future expectations have a huge impact as an influence on consumption. If you are concerned about future levels of income, you often will delay spending, particularly if you have an expectation of a drop in income. So people have that. They have an expectation that income levels are going to fall, and therefore certainly both on household items and even timing to buy houses in terms of purchasing a major dwelling have seen significant month-on-month drops, right, of over 30% in sentiment. So we can see that most of the fall is being driven by fears over future economic conditions for the next 12 months, and therefore then as a result concerns over future income levels and people's ability then to buy major expenditure items in the economy. So I think the overall indication of this is really consumer sentiment being such a big driver of aggregate demand as through consumption, which represents 60% of GDP, means that we're very much on the cards for rapid sort of reductions in aggregate demand, and therefore that likely recession. What does this mean for house prices, Terry?
So again, just to keep on with that, right? Because you were talking about how time to buy a dwelling as well was actually another measure in that consumer confidence index, and that has also fallen quite dramatically as well. Just not as much as economic conditions over the next 12 months, but it still has taken quite a big hit. And so I would imagine, the housing market is kind of exercising the same kind of caution, right? But that would be the expectation. But actually, I think it hasn't had, the dramatic effect that we probably are seeing in the other kind of economic indicators. And so, at least in theory, because Australia is currently quite, our household debt, we are quite indebted. We are quite over leveraged. Our household debt is at a record high of 186.5% of debt to household income. So we currently, have a lot more debt than what we're owning, right? And in those situations, if you're carrying such a large amount of debt, if unemployment then starts to edge up and you no longer have your income, you're in a very, very difficult situation. So we call this mortgage stress, when you basically aren't able to meet those mortgage payments because of a external change in your financial circumstances. And so the prediction is that if unemployment does get to that 10% mark, or even the 7.5% mark we were talking about, there is going to be a significant increase in mortgage stress. People might have to default on their loans, and therefore that will force some kind of downward pressure on prices. But it might be a bit early to call that, right? And so that's why I think the housing prices actually haven't fallen in April. In fact, they actually went up by 0.3% in April.
That's right. And look, I think a big factor in all of this that's yet to and you'll ultimately know it just in time, maybe for your HSC. It'll be a wonderful little gift for you to make sure that before you walk into the exam, is that a lot of the reason we're not seeing the impact yet is the banks have really come together as part of a response to Corona to basically have deferrals on payments, and anyone that's in mortgage stress can't be kicked out. So the point is the government's really working with the banks, tried to create this 6-month period of time whereby there won't be a whole lot of basically mortgage defaults. There won't be people that are unable to pay because there's the flexibility with the deferrals and so forth that are in place. But when that period ends, which will end in September, that's the 6-month period, I think that's where it's going to start to get interesting to see then when, things are meant to return to, mortgage repayments as normal, and employment may not have yet returned to normal. So people will have less money. There'll be people working less. I think we may then see, more housing, housing market changes, particularly with, defaults occurring, more supply coming onto the market, less demand continuing due to consumer sentiment, and therefore downward pressure occurring on prices. But I think at the moment, it's probably a little too early to tell due to what the government's put in place to try to, and what the banks have come to the table with.
I think it's interesting that you do mention that 6 months, because I wanted to add something on about just the overall the overall state of the economy, is that when we do get to that 6-month period, I actually saw something about a W-shaped recovery, in that after that 6 months of hand holding from fiscal policy, and from the banks, there's going to be basically a massive drop-off in the amount of stimulus being provided to the economy. And so we might actually get a situation where we do recover, but, you know, once we let go of all that stimulus, we might fall right back down again, and therefore making a little bit of a W shape.
It's almost like a W, but it's almost like a V and then a U. If that makes sense, and then right? Because it's like the V is the quick recovery because of the cash that's coming through, but then when it runs out, it's the U because we've got the slower return, right? Rather, because I think a W implies like another quick jump back, but I'm maybe not so confident of that. But I think that's a great point. So I guess, Terry, what does this all mean for inflation?
Well, inflation is interesting because I think when the numbers came out for April as well, it was a bit of a one-off thing. Because if you remember back in March, Rowan, if you went to the supermarket, you couldn't get anything, right? And so inflation was, I guess, edged up a little bit in April simply because, you know, we had that mass hysteria of panic buying of you know, supermarket goods. But again, I think inflation is one of those indicators here where we're just going to have to wait and see. So we're going to have to see, you know, for example, what's going to happen with unemployment, what's going to happen with wages. Something I want to share just as a you know, obviously a public sector worker. This week the state government did announce that they wanted to freeze the pay rises of public sector workers, so teachers and nurses included. So there definitely does seem, you know, need to be, I guess, a little bit more analysis done for us to really know the inflation.
And I think what's going to happen here is there's a lot of noise. So it makes it actually hard to get a real sense of where the data is going to land. Because, you know, you've got on the one hand massive, you know, fiscal stimulus packages at a federal and state level, and so you've got and very low, you know, historically low monetary policy, quantitative easing. You've got all of these things which in a traditional environment would rapidly create inflationary pressure. But then on the other side, you've got, you know, lockdowns, job losses, industry closures, wage freezes, as you've just highlighted. So where it's going to land in between that, it's anyone's guess. Now, I think for me, the other factor in all of this as well is that if inflation measures a basket of goods, it also requires us to be buying that said basket of goods. And what's been happening is our purchasing habits have changed dramatically. I mean, clearly evidenced by the rampant buying of, you know, tin cans and toilet paper and whatever it is, and then ignoring all sorts of other items for purchase. Now, hopefully some of that's been pushed out of the system. But I think it still means that, you know, if we've got like a commodity of goods and a lot of shops are closed and we're not able to purchase as much, it's going to be hard to see really where inflation's at. And to some extent, you know, I think the sense is that even though, you know, for the RBA, you know, inflation targeting is their sort of core primary you know, objectives that they use to then look at the lens through the other objectives that they need to hit. I feel like really the priority over this year is not going to be all that much on inflation. I think, you know, I think clearly what we're seeing is economic growth is the driver. We need to sort that out first. What are your thoughts, Terry, and what are the RBA's estimates at this point anyway in terms of inflation?
Yeah, I think it's just going to be something which, like I said earlier, we're just going to have to wait and see because, like you said, there's just so much noise going on at the moment. So many unprecedented, you know, events going on. Like we're using quantitative easing for the first time, and I think we're just going to have to see. The RBA themselves, their belief is that inflation is going to be below 2% for the next few years. Now, I believe that might be an example of forward guidance because they are coming out here and anchoring that in their media releases, letting people know our expectation for inflation is going to be quite low. It's going to be below the 2% to 3% target. And if you remember from the core theory, we do say that inflationary expectations often do have quite an influence on the level of inflation itself. And then also we've got this. We've looked at the March quarter numbers, but for the next quarter, we're probably going to see some negative inflation simply because we're going to be factoring in, you know, and just to, you know, to add to that thing, the point you mentioned about how the basket of goods that we're buying have dramatically changed. So obviously, if we're not buying that, we're no longer buying that basket of goods, then we won't really expect to see much inflationary pressure on that basket of goods. We've also had, really low oil prices, which is great, if you want to fuel the car, but and also, of course, the introduction of free childcare. All of these things, I think, will just brew up this perfect storm to actually get a little bit of negative inflation. Where it goes from there, though, I'm not so sure. What does the RBA say, though, for 2021?
Well, I think the RBA is still expecting it's going to be between 1 and 1.5%, which, to be honest, I think is probably, again, very generous. If we think about pre-COVID, we were, 1.8?
1.8.
And things were maybe not crash hot, but they were relatively, they were a lot better. Let's say that. So, I think it may still yet be positive, but I guess part of it is really, to what extent is the size of the fiscal stimulus going to look like? I mean, that's still clearly, even for the federal government, that's still a question that they're working out daily. So I think, it's pretty hard to get a sense of that. Just a quick one on this, because, small businesses have been particularly impacted. What's been some of the impact on small business in the economy?
Well, from what I've seen, a lot of them have had to completely pivot, their business strategy and their business model, right? A lot of them have had to learn how to just deliver things, basically get into the delivery game, right? And so to do takeaways in the hospitality, and also just provide opportunities for workers to work remotely, work from home. And so the ABS has shown that over basically 90% of businesses were expected to have some kind of impact due to coronavirus. So really nobody has missed that. Us included, in the education industry, we have been impacted as well. And so in hospitality in particular, there was 70% of businesses in hospitality who had to reduce hours of their staff, and 43% either had to sack workers or basically place them on unpaid leave. Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think just to highlight, though, that I think it's just how far-reaching, and we spoke about this briefly in part one, but I think, this data is interesting to show that, the GFC was, while it had far-reaching economic consequences, was ultimately that financial crisis. It was particularly driven by, the financial sector. Whereas we can see here that even if certain industries like the hospitality sector are being impacted, or the tourism sector, for example, are being impacted more than others, ultimately still 90% of businesses across the country are expected to be impacted. So we can see that it's also why the impact we're seeing on unemployment and on economic growth is so much more far-reaching than, and consumer sentiment was a good example of this, so much more far-reaching than prior crises and economic recessions, because of just the sheer breadth of its impact. What's the impact been for the Australian dollar, Terry?
Well, I think just to bring in some things, I guess, obviously, if you're going to talk about the Australian dollar, we've got to bring some things in from our part one video, because our Australian dollar interacts and depends so much on just international forces. And so the first thing is obviously China. We said that China, obviously, they had their negative 6.8% economic growth, but they are really trying their best to emerge from, the coronavirus with a fresh approach to stimulus. So they're really trying to stimulate their way back on track. And obviously, they're going to continue doing what they have done for quite some time, which is infrastructure. There's lots of spending on infrastructure, and in that case, they will obviously demand our commodities, and that could potentially provide a little bit of upward pressure on the Australian dollar.
And I think what we see is, right now it's at about 67 cents. It's been sitting in the sort of mid to high 60s pretty consistently. We certainly did see, a low, in March when everything really when everything hit the fan, so to speak, and it went to a low of 57 cents. Which was, this is all compared to the US dollar, to be clear. So it hit a low of 57 cents, which I think is, incredibly low. Now, a lot of that was being driven by why was our dollar under so much sort of downward pressure? Why has it sort of seemed to, recover again and sort of sit back in those high 60s, Terry?
Well, I think it's just a sign of how intrinsically linked and connected we are with China. And so the performance of the Chinese economy seems to almost have like a direct correlation with the performance of the Australian dollar. So obviously, if in March we remember that China was still fighting through. They were still getting ready to reopen the economy, and that's why we depreciated so heavily, was because the Chinese economy was not performing well. And so moving forward, if the Chinese economy improves, we should probably also expect the Australian dollar to perform a little bit better.
Now, this has created some ongoing positives, though, for Australia. I think that's one of the interesting things to highlight here. And we saw it anyway emerge largely over 2019 anyway, which was the fact that, from a balance of payments point of view, we actually moved, to almost not a historical. We've had current account surpluses before, but certainly they're very, very, very rare, and we don't see them come around all that often. And I think what was interesting is that on the back of a low dollar last year, 2019, we saw ourselves achieve a current account surplus, just simply because it meant that our exports were incredibly price competitive internationally. And on the flip side, imports were more expensive, and thus we imported less relative. Now, of course, I think that the dollar being lower and continuing to stay low, this year is going to continue that trend. And also given what's going on, I think it's potentially likely we'll see lower levels of imports just due to, less international travel and freight, and a bigger drive from a sovereignty and a security point of view to manufacture locally. I think we're going to see that trend sort of continue. How long it will continue for, given the structural issues that we have in the Australian economy that really drive, our current account and balance of payments performance, is another story. But I think the implication of this is that, we're probably going to see ongoing current account surpluses quarterly for probably the rest of this year. So, it's just, again, to highlight, guys, that this really is very far-reaching in how you can integrate this into the entire HSC economic course. Now, just as we start wrapping up, Terry, in terms of a quick, okay, now that we've looked at, some of the key, things in the Australian economy and key economic issues, what's the sort of overall picture that the RBA is certainly trying to present about where they think the economy is going to go?
Yeah, I think it's important that we do, use the RBA's figures. I think as economic students, first of all, the RBA's website is often very easy to navigate. It's very user-friendly, very nice graphics, lots of nice statistics tables and whatnot. All right, but I think at this current stage, there's this, like you said, there's so much just analysis being done by all these different stakeholders. You've got your banks, you've got your big corporations, you've obviously got the Reserve Bank. I think it's good just to kind of have a little bit of a centralized point, so that you do, if you do want to use a certain set of data, that you are staying consistent with it. So obviously the RBA, they do these forecasts every month, and I think it's a good starting point. So I really do, think it's a good idea to go with what the RBA is saying. And what they are saying is, for economic growth, they are expecting 8% drop year on year for June this year. By December, it will be a 6% drop year on year. And then, as we were saying, with that V-shaped recovery, by June of 2021, they're expecting it to probably pop back up to 7%. And then December 2021, it'll be 6%. And then June 2022, we'll hopefully be back on our feet, and it'll be a 5% year-on-year increase. And
so then we can see as well, if we look at that, right, they've also shared how that compares to their previous expectation. So we see that in June 2020, that expected 2% growth. So the -8 is a 10% turnaround, which is quite significant in economic growth. If we look at the 6% at the end of -6% growth for the end of 2020, that expected 2.75%. We've got an 8.75% turnaround there. So I think we can see that the impact is very, very significant. It's really very much, not even a once in a lifetime. It's almost a once in a historical, in terms of what we're seeing right now, impact on the economy. Now, with unemployment, it's interesting. They're saying June 2020, 10%. Year ended December 2020, 9%. But note, and I'm not going to go through all the years, I think even by June 2022, it's only then do they think going to go back to 6.5%. So we can see that that's really a 2-year period with unemployment still being higher than it was pre-COVID. 6.5 versus the 5.2 that we had. So we can really see that lag. And in most cases, that's almost a doubling, certainly, now and by the end of the year of the unemployment rate that they expected. What about inflation? I know we spoke briefly, but what's the sort of projected forecast for inflation and the differences, Terry?
Yeah, so as we established, we're expecting, at least in the next couple of months, for June, we're expecting it to be a negative. So an example of deflation, right, so of about 1%. And what's interesting to me is then by June of next year, so I'll just go by June, so June 2021, they're actually a little bit optimistic here, it looks like. They're thinking a 2.75% inflation rate. And my guess here would be that that's when they really believe, the economic recovery is going to flow on to consumers, and they're really going to start coming out and adding a little bit of just inflationary pressure with their consumption, with their spending. And then after that, inflation is just going to fall back a little bit by June 2022 to about 1.5%. So it's just interesting just to see, what their kind of expectation of the turnaround is.
Awesome. So there you have it, guys. I mean, that's just a bit of an example of looking at the data across the economy and seeing how Corona is impacting. I think, a couple of things to take out from here would be, one, you're going to have to stay really closely up to date with the economy. I think often, as we've talked about, you can not get away with, but certainly that if the data remains much more consistent, the need to be staying up to date is less important, because you could probably use the data from 2 months ago and it hasn't changed so much. We're certainly not seeing that. So one, if you're watching this already, you're probably already the sort of person that does want to stay up to date, which is fantastic. But if you're not, this highlights that actually it's going to be really, really important to make sure that you stay up to date with what's happening. I think secondly, it also means that, for the parts of the course that you have covered already, depending on the structure that you have done of this course, you might have done topic 4 and then 3 first, or even if you've done 1 or 2 and you're now in topic 3 and 4, I'd really encourage you to go back over whatever you've done, if it's topic 2 or 3 or 4, and start to get this data and statistics and start to integrate it as examples into your notes. Because it's going to be absolutely critical in what you're writing about, whether or not it's a discuss or an analyze or an explain as an essay or even in the short answers. And secondly, you're probably going to run out of time to do a good job of it when trials hit. So my sense really would be, trials are 10 to 12 weeks away, depending on your school and when they're going to have it. And so really over the next sort of, 4 to 5 weeks, it's a really good opportunity to start actually collecting a lot of this data that's now emerging and pulling it into your study notes, into the relevant sections. And as you can see, it's incredibly far reaching. I don't think there's really a topic in the course that is studied that you would not be able to use some of this data for to further provide examples and case studies of, the economic theory in action. So Terry, any final comments from you before we wrap up for today?
Well, yeah, I just think it's very important that if you are going to, obviously, and you should be taking down statistics and examples, that you just make sure that you are, I guess, prepared to use them. I think a lot of students often, they have a lot of good data, but they don't necessarily feel confident using them. So I think one thing, to help you, maybe while you are taking down these stats, maybe also just take a few notes about how you would analyze that and what that actually specifically means. If it's something which Rowan or I have said, just go for it. Yeah, write down, how we've analyzed it. Go for it. But I think it is important just to make sure that you don't just have the numbers, you also have the analysis behind them.
Awesome, and that is a fantastic point. I think you're right on there, Terry. So now, guys, look, just as we wrap up, this is part 2 of a 3-part series. Our third part will be looking at, okay, what is the Australian government doing? What has been the economic policy response to coronavirus? And we're going to do some analysis. We're going to be analysing the policy and the likely impact it may have. And this is going to be, I think, the core of your essays, ultimately. It'll be looking at, particularly if you get questions on the macroeconomic impact of policy on the economy, you're going to need to be able to deconstruct it and analyze where it's successful and where it's not. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing as we really run through what the policies have been and then the likely impact. So if you haven't already, hit subscribe. We'll be announcing and releasing these videos successively, so that way you get notified of when the next video is live. And of course, if you have any questions or comments about HSC Economics, the impact of Corona on the economy, if you need more help, leave a comment below, and either Terry, myself, or one of our team will do our best to answer you. Otherwise, all the best. And, we will see you in the next episode of HSC Economics Review.